The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty street. Agent Taylor had just finished her day, heading home after another round of investigations. She was a dedicated FBI agent, respected in her field and admired for her unshakable calm in the most intense situations. But today, things were different. As she drove through the quiet suburban neighborhood, she noticed the flashing lights of a police cruiser behind her. She didn't think much of it at first, believing it might be a routine check, as many officers did in this area. But as she slowed down and pulled over to the side, the officer's approach seemed off. A tall man, dressed in a standard police uniform, stepped out from behind the cruiser. He walked over to her car with slow, deliberate steps, his face hidden behind a pair of sunglasses. Agent Taylor, familiar with the way these encounters usually went, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, her posture calm and professional. She had nothing to hide. The officer, however, was already staring at her with suspicion. "License and registration," he said gruffly, his tone not as friendly as most police officers would offer during a traffic stop. "Of course," Agent Taylor replied smoothly, reaching for her wallet in the glove compartment. She knew the drill and was already ready to present her credentials if needed. As she handed over the paperwork, she also slid her FBI badge across the seat, showing it to him clearly. The officer took a moment to look at the badge, and Agent Taylor expected him to recognize it immediately. But to her surprise, he didn't even flinch. Instead, he glanced at her with narrowed eyes and then back at the badge, almost as if he was dismissing it altogether. "FBI. Huh. What brings you around these parts?" the officer asked, his voice cold, almost as if her identity meant nothing to him. "I'm just heading home after finishing my shift," Agent Taylor answered, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm based in the city, but I was working in the area today." The officer didn't respond right away. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes lingering on her. Then, without another word, he asked, "Step out of the vehicle." Agent Taylor felt a twinge of confusion. There was no reason for him to ask that. She was a federal agent. She had done nothing wrong. She knew her rights, and this was not a standard procedure for a routine traffic stop. But she remained calm, choosing not to escalate things. "Is there a reason I need to get out of the car?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. The officer's expression hardened. "Just get out of the car. Now." She hesitated for a second, but then opened the door slowly and stepped out. She was trying to keep the situation under control, but as soon as she did, the officer stepped forward aggressively, his hand resting on his holster. "Listen, I need you to step over here and put your hands behind your back," he said, as though she were the one who had done something wrong. There was an edge to his words that wasn't lost on her. Something was off. The officer's demeanor had shifted from suspicion to hostility, and Agent Taylor couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't acting professionally. She knew she was about to be treated unfairly, and she couldn't understand why. "Is there a reason you're arresting me?" she asked again, now keeping her voice calm but full of authority. Resisting arrest, the officer spat, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. But Taylor hadn't done anything to resist. What was going on here? Why was she being treated like this? Agent Taylor stood still, her eyes fixed on Officer Brooks as he motioned for her to turn around. She could feel her heart rate picking up, but she refused to let panic take control. She had dealt with tense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. Something deeper was at play. As she faced the officer, she couldn't help but notice how he seemed to enjoy the power he held over her. His posture was rigid, his gaze unyielding. He wasn't just performing his duty, he was making a point. Agent Taylor, despite being a federal agent with years of experience, found herself momentarily uncertain. How had things escalated so quickly? Why had he ignored her badge, her authority, and every logical explanation? "I'm not resisting anything," she said calmly, her voice steady but firm. "You have no reason to arrest me." But Officer Brooks didn't seem to hear her. He continued to glare at her, his hand still hovering over his holster, as if waiting for her to make a move. Her training kicked in, and she knew she had to remain composed. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her into reacting rashly. "You're going to need to explain yourself," Agent Taylor said again, her eyes locked onto his, trying to read him. There was no reason to think this was anything other than an abuse of power. She had the right to remain silent, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference here. Instead, she decided to assert herself with clarity. The officer's lips twisted into a smug grin, as if her calm demeanor somehow irritated him. He glanced down at her badge once more, but instead of acknowledging it as proof of her authority, he simply shrugged and took a step closer, almost daring her to challenge him. "Don't think I'm going to just let you walk away because you've got a shiny badge," he muttered under his breath, barely audible but enough for her to hear. There it was. That was the moment when Agent Taylor realized what was going on. He wasn't questioning her because of the law. He was questioning her because of who she was. Her race, her identity, everything about her was the issue. She stayed calm, refusing to let the officer's words get under her skin. She had dealt with prejudice before, but never in such an open, confrontational way. She could feel her body tense, but she reminded herself to stay focused. If she lost control, everything would unravel, and she wouldn't let that happen. "Listen," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just asking you to follow the law and do your job properly. I have a right to know why I'm being treated like this." But Officer Brooks didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his radio, his actions slow and deliberate, as though he was trying to make it seem like she was the one causing the disturbance. She watched him, her mind racing. Would he try to make this even worse by fabricating charges? Would this be her only opportunity to set the record straight? "Let's get this over with," the officer said, his voice cold and dismissive. He stepped away for a moment to speak into his radio, and Agent Taylor felt a chill wash over her. There was nothing she could do but wait, but she was no longer just waiting for a solution. She was preparing for the battle ahead. In the distance, a few onlookers had begun to gather, watching the scene unfold with curious eyes. Some seemed to recognize her, but most remained silent, unsure of what was really happening. And though they didn't speak, Agent Taylor could sense the eyes of the world on her. Agent Taylor stood there, her mind working faster than her body. Every instinct told her to fight back, to demand answers, to resist what was clearly an unfair situation. But her training reminded her to stay composed. Losing her cool could make things worse. Instead, she had to think strategically, stay calm, and navigate through the mess without escalating it further. The officer, still with a cold and dismissive expression, suddenly turned towards her and snapped, "Put your hands behind your back." A moment of shock passed over Taylor's face, but it was brief. She knew she had to comply with his orders, even if they were unjust. Fighting back in that moment would only give him more reason to treat her harshly. So she carefully placed her hands behind her back, her mind racing for the best way to handle the situation. "Why am I being arrested?" she asked again, her voice firm but steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to do my job." But Officer Brooks didn't respond. Instead, he moved quickly to cuff her, his movements rough and quick, as though he was eager to get this over with. She felt the cold metal of the cuffs close around her wrists, the pressure slightly uncomfortable, but she didn't show any sign of pain. Inside, she was angry. How could this be happening? She was an FBI agent, someone who worked to uphold justice, yet here she was, on the receiving end of injustice. Taylor knew she had the right to remain silent, but she didn't want to be passive. She needed to maintain control over the situation. As the officer tugged at her to lead her towards the police car, she could feel the eyes of the bystanders on her, watching in silence. Some were recording the scene on their phones, others whispering amongst themselves, trying to make sense of what was happening. But in that moment, Taylor felt a wave of determination rise within her. She wouldn't let this be the moment they saw her break. As they reached the police car, Taylor tried. Agent Taylor stepped out of the police car and into the small, dimly lit precinct. The door swung open, and the officer led her inside with a firm hand at her back. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the hallway as she was ushered down to a holding area. Despite the cuffs around her wrists, she stood tall, her posture still confident. But inside, her mind was swirling. She couldn't believe this was happening. She, an experienced FBI agent, had just been arrested for doing nothing wrong. This wasn't just about her. It was about everything that was wrong with the system. The holding area was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights above. Agent Taylor stood in her small, cold cell, her thoughts racing. She had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose her focus. Every minute that passed brought her closer to figuring out how to take control of this situation, how to prove that what was happening to her wasn't just wrong. It was a violation of the very system she had dedicated her life to serving. She could hear the faint sounds of footsteps outside the door again. This time, there was no hesitation. The officer had returned, and she could feel a shift in the air. He wasn't just here to check on her. He was here for a reason. The door creaked open, and Agent Taylor stood at attention, her posture straight and confident, as if nothing had shaken her. She had to make sure she kept her composure. There was no room for fear or anger in this moment. A different officer entered the room, a man with a calm expression and a clipboard in his hand. He didn't seem as hostile as the first officer, but there was something about the way he carried himself that told her he wasn't here to help. He was just following orders. "Agent Taylor, I'm Officer Daniels. I'm here to ask you a few questions," he said, his voice measured and professional. She met his eyes, careful not to show any emotion. "I don't understand why I'm being treated like this. I'm an FBI agent. I've done nothing wrong." Officer Daniels nodded, but it wasn't a sympathetic nod. It was almost as if he was trying to keep his distance from her. "We're just trying to get to the bottom of this situation. The arresting officer is filing a report, and we need to know your side of the story." Taylor felt a flicker of hope. This could be her chance to clear things up, to explain what had really happened. But she had learned the hard way that hope alone wasn't enough. She had to stay sharp, to navigate this conversation carefully. "I told Officer Brooks who I was. I showed him my badge. But he didn't listen. He didn't even take it seriously," Taylor said, her voice calm but steady. "He was looking for a reason to arrest me from the moment he pulled me over. And I don't know why." Officer Daniels scribbled something on his clipboard, his eyes never leaving her. "We're aware of the situation. It's being reviewed," he said, his tone cool. "But you must understand, we need to be sure this is all a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Taylor couldn't hold back her frustration any longer. "He arrested me for resisting arrest, and I didn't even resist. I was doing everything by the book, trying to get him to follow procedure, but he wasn't listening. This isn't just a misunderstanding, it's an abuse of power." Officer Daniels paused for a moment, his eyes scanning her face. He seemed to be considering her words, but his expression didn't change. "Look, Agent Taylor, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm just trying to do my job. But if you want to explain your side, now's the time." Taylor took a deep breath. She couldn't afford to let her emotions take over, not now. "I want you to understand that this isn't just about one bad officer. This is about something bigger, about how people like me are treated differently just because of who we are, just because of the color of my skin." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Officer Daniels didn't say anything. He simply stood there, as if her words had given him something to think about. Taylor couldn't tell if he was truly reflecting on what she said, or if he was simply trying to get through the conversation. But for the first time since she'd arrived at the precinct, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this officer would listen. Finally, Officer Daniels set the clipboard down on the small table in front of him. "We're going to look into this, Agent Taylor," he said, his tone softer now. "But for now, you'll need to wait for further instructions." Taylor nodded, still cautious but thankful for the small shift in the conversation. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least she had planted a seed. If he truly listened, if he truly understood, things might begin to change. As Officer Daniels left the room, Agent Taylor sat back on the metal bench, her mind still racing. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer willing to stay silent. She had a voice, and she was going to use it. The silence in the small holding room felt almost suffocating as Agent Taylor sat on the cold metal bench, her mind racing. The conversation with Officer Daniels had been a small, albeit brief, step forward. It wasn't much, but at least she knew her words hadn't fallen on deaf ears. She had spoken the truth, and now, it seemed, she had planted a seed of doubt in the officer's mind. But that didn't change the fact that she was still stuck in this cold, unfamiliar place, uncertain about what would happen next. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Taylor tried to steady her thoughts. She knew that the longer she stayed in this holding room, the more likely it was that she'd be forgotten or dismissed. The situation had already gone on far too long, and the longer it dragged on, the harder it would be to fix. But then, just as the weight of the silence began to press down on her, the door swung open again. This time, it wasn't Officer Daniels. Instead, another officer stepped in, one who looked more serious and professional, with an air of authority that Taylor couldn't ignore. "Agent Taylor," the officer asked, his voice steady but stern. Taylor stood up immediately, brushing the stray thoughts from her mind. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Sergeant Reynolds," the officer said as he stepped into the room. He gave her a polite nod, but his eyes were sharp, scanning her for any sign of resistance. "We've reviewed the incident, and I've spoken with the arresting officer. I'm here to get your side of the story in more detail." Taylor nodded, relieved that someone was finally taking her seriously. "I've already told Officer Daniels everything," she said, trying to keep her tone calm but assertive. "But I'll explain again. Officer Brooks didn't give me a chance. I showed him my badge, told him who I was, but he didn't care. He treated me like a criminal from the moment he pulled me over." Sergeant Reynolds looked at her intently. "We're aware of the arrest details, but we want to make sure we're looking at this from every angle. What you say matters, Agent. You need to understand that." Taylor nodded, gathering her thoughts. She had a chance to make things right, and she couldn't waste it. "The truth is, I was just doing my job. I had no reason to be stopped, no reason to be arrested. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I know the law. I know what's right, and I know when something is wrong. What happened to me was wrong." Sergeant Reynolds remained silent for a moment, absorbing what she had said. Then, slowly, he spoke. "We've had a few complaints about Officer Brooks in the past. Nothing serious, but enough for us to take a second look at this. The video of the arrest has made it to our department, and people are talking." That was a relief. Taylor had known that the video, which had been filmed by a bystander, would be key. It was her word against the officers, and with that video, the truth could not be denied. "Is he going to be investigated?" Taylor asked, her voice steady, but she couldn't hide the edge of hope in her words. Sergeant Reynolds nodded. "We've already started an internal review, and we're going to look into his past conduct as well. We can't let something like this slide, no matter who's involved." Taylor felt a rush of relief. This wasn't over yet, but at least now it seemed like the wheels of justice were finally turning. Officer Brooks wouldn't be able to hide behind his badge. The truth was coming to light, and there was no way to ignore it any longer. "I appreciate you listening," Taylor said, her voice sincere but still guarded. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "I understand," Sergeant Reynolds said, his tone softening. "We'll make sure we get to the bottom of this." As the officer turned and left the room, closing the door behind him, Taylor took a deep breath. She wasn't out of the woods yet. She knew that. There was still the matter of the investigation, the public scrutiny, and the fact that her career and reputation were now on the line. But for the first time since she had been pulled over by Officer Brooks, she felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before the right people saw it and took action. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving that injustice would never go unchallenged, no matter how long it took. The following days felt like an endless waiting game for Agent Taylor. Even though she had spoken out, shared her side of the story, and even watched as the investigation into Officer Brooks began to unfold, there was still a feeling of uncertainty hanging in the air. The precinct's walls seemed to close in around her, and despite the steps being taken, Taylor couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. Every moment that passed was another reminder that this situation wasn't over yet. Her colleagues in the FBI were supportive, reaching out with messages of encouragement and reassurance. They knew she had done the right thing, and they made it clear that they would stand by her no matter what. But there was still something deep inside her that gnawed at her. What if this didn't go the way she hoped? What if the system, the very system she had worked so hard to be a part of, failed her? Yet, through the uncertainty, Taylor held on to the truth. She knew what had happened. She knew that she had been unfairly targeted, that her professionalism had been dismissed because of her identity. She knew that the only way forward was to continue fighting for the right thing, no matter the obstacles. One afternoon, just as she was beginning to lose track of the days, her phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, but something about it made her pick up immediately. "Agent Taylor," a voice on the other end asked. "This is Detective Lawson with the Internal Affairs Division. We've made some progress with your case." Her heart skipped a beat. "What progress?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's happened?" "We've conducted interviews with multiple officers, and the footage from the arrest has been reviewed," Lawson said. "It's clear that Officer Brooks acted inappropriately, and we're moving forward with an investigation into his conduct. This is just the beginning, but we wanted you to know we're taking this seriously." A rush of relief flooded through Taylor, and for a moment, she felt like she could finally exhale. It was happening. The wheels of justice were turning, and she wasn't going to be left behind. She had fought for this, spoken out, and now things were starting to fall into place. "Thank you, Detective," Taylor replied, her voice tight with emotion. "I just want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did. I want to make sure this never happens again." "I understand," Lawson said. "We'll keep you updated as the investigation continues. We're committed to seeing this through." After the call ended, Taylor sat back, trying to process the information. This wasn't just a small victory. This was a crucial turning point. Officer Brooks wasn't just facing internal scrutiny anymore. This was becoming a bigger issue. The public had taken notice, the department was taking notice, and now the investigation would determine the consequences for his actions. Over the next few days, as the investigation into Officer Brooks deepened, Taylor watched as things began to shift. There was an outpouring of support for her. Her story was gaining traction, not just within the FBI, but across the community. The video of the arrest had gone viral, and people were speaking out about the injustice she had faced. Even though she was still grappling with the emotional toll of the experience, Taylor couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was part of something larger, something that could create real change. It was empowering to know that her actions had sparked a conversation, and that others were standing up with her. As the days passed, Taylor continued to stay in touch with Detective Lawson and her colleagues. She kept her focus on the investigation, determined to see it through to the end. But there was a new sense of hope within her. The idea that change could happen, that one person's voice could make a difference, it was no longer a distant dream. It was real. And then, finally, the day came when she received another call. It was from Detective Lawson again. This time, his voice was more serious. "Agent Taylor, we've completed the investigation into Officer Brooks. Based on the findings, he's been placed on administrative leave pending further disciplinary action. His actions were a violation of department policy, and we've moved forward with a recommendation for his termination." Taylor felt a rush of relief and vindication. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. The consequences were real. and the truth had prevailed. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't tell you how much this means." "You did the right thing, Agent Taylor," Lawson said. "We all have a responsibility to uphold the law, and you stood up for that. This is just the beginning, but it's a step in the right direction." The days following the investigation into Officer Brooks felt like a whirlwind for Agent Taylor. What had started as a personal battle against an unjust arrest had turned into something much bigger. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about challenging the system that needed to change, a system that allowed prejudice and bias to influence how people were treated. She had hoped that her actions would spark a conversation, but she never imagined the ripple effect would be so far-reaching. Taylor's story spread far beyond the confines of the precinct. News outlets picked up the story, and the video of her arrest was shared across social media, bringing attention to her case in a way that she never expected. People from all walks of life, across different races, backgrounds, and professions, reached out to her, sharing their own experiences with injustice. Some were fellow law enforcement officers, others were everyday citizens who had been treated unfairly by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Taylor felt a weight lifted from her shoulders as she saw the support pouring in. It wasn't just sympathy, it was solidarity. It was clear that people were ready to stand up for what was right. The attention was a double-edged sword, though. As much as she appreciated the support, she knew that this kind of exposure also brought scrutiny. She couldn't afford to rest easy, even though the investigation into Officer Brooks was moving forward. But with the truth coming to light, Taylor also realized the importance of her role in this larger fight. She was no longer just an FBI agent, working behind the scenes. She was becoming a symbol, a voice for change. She knew that this experience would follow her for the rest of her career, but in a way, it had changed her too. She was more determined than ever to ensure that others who found themselves in similar situations wouldn't be silenced. As the weeks passed, Officer Brooks was officially terminated from his position. The department had moved swiftly to address the issue, and it was clear that his actions had serious consequences. But Taylor knew that the battle was far from over. This was just one example, one case that had caught the public's attention. There were countless others, countless stories of individuals who were overlooked or mistreated because of their race, gender, or background. In the aftermath, Taylor was invited to speak at a national conference on law enforcement reform. She hesitated at first. She had never been one to seek the spotlight. But she knew that if she could use her experience to make a difference, to help others understand the importance of fairness and accountability, then it was worth it. She stood before a room full of law enforcement officials, advocates, and community leaders, sharing her story and urging them to look at the systemic problems within their own departments. Her speech was met with standing ovations, but Taylor didn't focus on the applause. What mattered to her was the change she could inspire, the policies she could help shape, and the way her story could become part of a larger movement toward justice. She was no longer just an individual speaking out. She was part of a collective effort, one that had the potential to reshape how law enforcement interacted with communities. As Taylor reflected on everything that had happened, she realized how much she had grown. The quiet, determined agent who had once kept her head down was now an outspoken advocate for justice, using her position and her voice to challenge the status quo. She knew the fight wasn't over, that there would always be more work to be done. But as she looked back at how far she had come, from that tense traffic stop to standing before a room full of decision-makers, she felt a sense of pride. Her actions had made a difference, but more importantly, they had started a conversation that needed to happen. And as she moved forward, she knew that change was possible, one step at a time. Taylor had proven that one person's voice, no matter how small it seemed in the beginning, could echo through the corridors of power and create a shift that would be felt for generations. The fight for justice was ongoing, but with each victory, it became more clear that the world was ready to listen.